It is live. So we are live now. Good evening, everybody. It is my distinct pleasure. I'm Samudra, by the way. So, on behalf of Team Voyages into the Past, or Otit Probaho, it is my distinct pleasure today to introduce our esteemed guests, Sarbpreet Singh and Dr. Ishmeet Kaur Chaudhry, who will be discussing the fascinating volume Night of the Restless Spirit, which really chronicles the tale of the human tragedy and the horrors of 1984, which we will be getting into shortly afterward. But before that, a quick introduction to our esteemed speakers. Sarbpreet Singh is a writer, commentator, and podcaster based in Boston. His most recent book is Night of the Restless Spirit, a collection of short fiction examining the life events of 1984 from many different angles. His podcast, Story of the Sikhs, has listeners in over 90 countries. He's also the author of The Camel Merchant of Philadelphia. He's also active on Twitter, where he can be contacted. Dr. Ishmeet Kaur Chaudhry, educationist, author, and poet, teaches at the Center of English Studies at the Central University of Gujarat, Gandhinagar. She was recognized as inspired teacher for the President of India's in-residence program at Rashtrapati Bhawan, New Delhi in June 2015. She has been a recipient of the MHRD's GIAN course on Marginality and Literature in 2016. Her interests in research center around issues related to literatures of the margins, social movements, studies of violence and trauma. Uh, she has also been actively engaged in comparative studies and translations from Punjabi into English. Her recent work has been on violence studies, engaging with discourses on women and violence, and the 1984 Anti-Sikh carnage in Delhi. An editor of Black November writings on Anti-Sikh Massacres of 1984 and the aftermath, the author of Texting the Sri Guru Granth Sahib, and the visionary poetics of Patrick White. Sure, okay. Wait. So without wait, just excuse me for a moment. I'm very sorry. I just faced a quick connectivity issue. Like, I'm very sorry about that again. So, uh, besides that, uh, uh, without any further delay, we would like to hand over the metaphorical mic to our esteemed speakers for the day. So, um, sorry. Uh,
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Samudra. And I would like to welcome Sarbpreet Singh, our esteemed author today. So it's a pleasure talking about your book today. And I think it's a very important subject for many of us. So as 1984 anti-Sikh carnage is no longer only a Sikh subject, because when we talk about violence, violence is something that affects everybody around. And it comes to us today as a shame on nation. And when these things repeatedly happen, we need to start questioning ourselves again and again that what kind of a society we are. What are we creating for ourselves? What are we leaving behind for our children? What's happening to the many girls and many women around us? What is the kind of security which the innocent citizens of this country face? And when we look at Churasi, after 36 years of when it happened in 1984, we need to engage with discourses around it. I come from a position where uh, recently edited an anthology called Black November, which talked about, which is actually a collection of interviews of the survivors, certain articles written regarding this matter, um, short stories, poems, and plays. So, coming from a school of literature, I was quite baffled and quite disappointed when I was looking for stories on Chaudhry. And the inquiry began by reading certain books on 9/11 and also watching a play on 2002 Godra. And that was when I was in discussion with my father, and my father told me his experience of Chorasi. And he told me both the sides of how his friends had helped him out and how some of his friends had turned against him. Um, I was 6 years old, and we were helped by a friend, and I grew up with those memories of friends coming to rescue you. So I did not quite understand the conflict until I engaged with my father on the subject. And something that my father said was, nobody talked about our stories. People talk about this story, people talk about that story, but nobody talked about our stories. And that was a very important inquiry for me, that who would talk about our stories. And then, as the African proverb goes, that if the lion doesn't speak for itself, we will always know about the lion from the hunter. So it became a responsibility for me, myself, and the many likes of me who were already writing, and I did get in touch with a lot of them. But what pained was that massive literature on 1984 was missing. Some of these seminal writers, and many I wouldn't name, but one I would definitely like to name, and I am really influenced by that writer, and she's Amrita Pritam, who wrote about Punjab, who wrote about women, completely missed out on 1984. And as I continue to work on something related to Amrita Pritam, even recently, I would always have that kind of maybe a small little complaint against her, that she didn't, talk about us, the new generations and what we went through. And this was not only limited to her, but it was also limited to many other writers, many other theorists who just did not want to talk about 84. The reasons may be many. Amitabh Ghosh did come up with an excellent book, Shadow Lines, and which had a precursor to 84. He said that was the reason that led him to write this book. But then he came up with an essay called The Ghost of Mrs. Gandhi. And there he reasons out, why perhaps there has been delay by writers for writing on 84. The essay needs to be debated. The essay needs to be talked about. And I think, but we are never late. We can always talk about stories. And when I see this book, the Spirits of the Restless Night, I am in fact elated, right? And I use the word elated. I know it's a very sad subject we are talking about. It's not a subject with like we talk about with great pleasure, but it's a subject where we talk about with a tinge of sadness and tragedy. But when I see literature emerging out, and the kind of literature and the sensitivity with which this book has come out, it's elating. So, sir, first of all, congratulations for doing this, and thank you for doing this. Thank you for caring enough to do this.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'll now just I'll just take another 2 minutes before we come on to listen to Sir. I know everybody is waiting to listen to Sarbpreet, and we'll just shift focus to him. So the book, in fact, this book is seminal in the sense that it explores different spaces. So the kind of literature or the kind of documentation, the word is documentation because literature is very less. It's now that certain novels and certain life writings are coming up on 84. Until now, what we've been doing is we've been just documenting 84. So the kind of documentation we have is about what actually happened. So we've been collecting stories of the survivors. We've been talking to them. We've been collecting stories of what happened in 84, resettlement stories of 85. Now we talk about injustice, right? But there is a different kind of a space to 84 which gets explored in this book. And that's the beauty of this book. And what is that space, you know? So in a country where different live together, in a country where people who are also polyglossic, come together, in that country, there is a lot of interaction of cultures. And it is this interaction of cultures which makes them tolerant because they get to know about each other. A lot of people feel that tolerance is a weakness. A lot of people feel that, if you are tolerant, you allow people to use you. But tolerance is actually a strength. Tolerance is actually an act of wisdom, because tolerance allows you to understand. Once you interact with people, you get to know about different cultures, and you move out of your own cocoons, right? Now, this book, in a way, does that. This book, in a way, spells out, the kind of society we are. It also brings out the strength of the society. And I would not be wrong in saying that these are stories of strength, So the stories explored in the stories explore different spaces. Space of a school, where there is young couple, school children, teenagers. They are infatuated to each other, and then a Kashmiri boy actually goes and interacts with this girl who is a Sikh girl and her family, and her brother, who is actually a very, very potential, who has a potential of a wonderful future because he's studying medicine. He would soon be a wonderful doctor. And it's then everything, turns with the political event that happens in the background. And the family comes to save, the family of the Kashmiri boy comes to save this family of the Sikh girl. This is, what is the strength? Because it's not simply a Hindu-Sikh riot. It's beyond that. There are so many dimensions to 84. How do we explore those? Urvashi Batalia talks about a methodology to study partition. Similarly, so what is the methodology to study 84? Where do we actually begin? How do we look at? How do we unravel those onion layers? And this is one of the ways in which Sarbpreet has done it. So when we look at it, then he also explores spaces, and he is not just simply blaming, okay, police did not do its duty, or there was a breakdown of entire machinery, the entire institutional machinery. He delves into it, and he brings out a perspective. And he says, okay, if 4 officers did not do anything, one did, right? One did take a stand. And there was a call of righteousness. There was a call of consciousness for that officer. And throughout his life, that officer lived a very, very difficult life. So these are the kind of stories, we have. I, in fact, begin, by inviting Sarbpreet to talk about the narratives of these stories. And my first question, so to say, is that, there is always a self projected within the stories. And one like as we go by reading these stories, it feels that it's your own story that you're saying. No matter, it's a story of an IS officer, or it's a story, being narrated by, the story of the Jallianwala Bagh, the Fateh Singh narrative, or it's a story of, this narrator in the first story called Paji, So one feels that there is a self, and as I go by reading these stories, and I'm sure as the readers have read the story, it's very difficult to detach your own self. So there is an engagement of the reader with that story. But I want to know about the engagement of the writer with these stories. So if I put it in clear words, Is it possible to detach the personal from, these political stories? Or is there a role of the personal in these political stories? And I do not look at them as fictional stories. I look at them as life writings. That's the sense that I get from these stories.
So, first of all, let me thank you for that very generous introduction and your very kind observations about my work. Before I answer your question, there are a couple of things that I want to address, picking up on some of the things that you said. And you said many interesting things that I want to talk about. You talked about the literature of partition. You talked about why it's important to talk about 1984. I very much resonate with the notion that 1984 is not a Sikh tragedy. It's not even an Indian tragedy, it's a human tragedy. Because from my perspective, it's just another instance of this terrible cycle of violence that we haven't been able to break out of for eons, really. So, in that sense, it's everyone's story, and it really needs to be told exactly for the reasons that you articulated. Now, drawing parallels between the literature of partition and the literature of 1984, I'm actually a little more hopeful than you are. And, maybe it's because I have much more gray hair, but, all facetiousness aside, uh, if you step back and look at 1984 in the broad sweep of history, we are still relatively close to the events. After all, they happened, 37 years ago. And writing about partition continues to emerge even until this day. So I am actually optimistic and hopeful because I see more and more stuff coming out. And again, here, I definitely want to acknowledge the excellence of your anthology, which has so much wonderful writing in it. N. Madhavan's story is worth the price of admission, if you ask me. It is such a
Thank you.
brilliant and deeply felt work, and the movie that came from it is equally brilliant, Kayataran from Shashi Kumar. But coming back to writing, you know, tomes have been written about partition. There's been so much written about partition. There have been academic writings on partition. But I can tell you that, reading Train to Pakistan, which is a slim novel, or reading Sadat Hasan Manto's Thanda Gosht, you know, these slim volumes or these short writings communicate the nuance of the terror and the inhumanity of partition probably much more effectively than a 1,000-page tome that documents what happened can. Maybe this is just me speaking because I am moved by literature, but that was definitely one of my motivations when I started to write these stories, which got published eventually in Night of the Restless Spirits. I also want to talk about one particular influence, on the title story and really the collection. When I was fairly young, I read 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And the one thing that stayed with me over the years and to me sort of emphasized the pain of 1984 and kept it alive was a particular incident in the book that the author writes about. He writes about the massacre of banana company workers in an unknown Latin American republic. And while the massacre itself is a huge tragedy, the erasure of the memory of the massacre from collective memory, to me, is an even bigger tragedy. That's what I remember.
Absolutely.
That's the aspect of that particular book that stayed with me for decades. And it definitely informed my writing when I wrote Night of the Restless Spirits. It might be interesting for you and the audience to know that these stories were actually written in two parts. A few of them were written more than 30 years ago, when, as a young man, I was first engaging with 1984 as I was engaging with my own identity. And that will bring me back to the answer to your question. And then some of them were written fairly recently, a couple of years before the publication of this collection of short fiction. And, my immature voice can probably be recognized easily in some of the earlier stories. But from a very personal perspective, getting to your question, yes, it's impossible for me to kind of distance myself from these stories, but I have to answer your question with a little more nuance and sort of explain how I approach them. As you observed early in the conversation, I also came from that privileged class in India, which is educated in elite schools, and which has a wall around it that protects it when horrible things happen. Case in point, while terrible things happened in Delhi, there is no denying the fact that most of the affluent Sikhs who lived behind these walls that I talk about were generally fine. And it was mostly poor Sikhs, those who lived in the so-called Trans-Yamuna colonies and places like Mongolpuri and places, in the northwestern part of Delhi. They were the ones who bore the brunt of what happened. So in that sense, when the events were occurring, I was largely insulated from them. There were other reasons. I was an undergraduate at that time in October, November 1984. I was in Pilani in Rajasthan, which is, several hours away from Delhi. And while there were some disturbances on campus, nothing of the scale of what had happened in Delhi happened on my campus. And remember, well, you don't remember because you were very young at that time, but, this was the pre-internet era, where your only sources of information were official media. You had All India Radio, you had Doordarshan, and of course, you had the newspapers. The narrative in all of official media was carefully crafted, and the brilliance of the crafting of the narrative would have done, the Nazi propaganda machine credit. And what I'm trying to say what I mean by that is, to this day, the most sympathetic voice about 1984 and the events of Delhi will inadvertently refer to the events as the Delhi riots. And we know that these were not riots. This was a pogrom. This was organized violence. But we have all been so influenced by the official narrative that 37 years later, even after understanding what had happened, we still inadvertently call it a riot. That was me in 1984. That was me until 1987 when I left India. Now, as a young man who had never lived in Punjab, during the period of the violence, I was in Pilani in Rajasthan, and then for the next couple of years before I left for the US for graduate study, I was in Mumbai. Both of these places, I definitely sort of experienced the weight of the official narrative, because every Sikh in those days was culpable. Nobody in their right mind would ever say that what happened in Delhi in 1984 was okay. But a lot of people in their hearts felt, you know what, the Sikhs kind of asked for it. How can I say this with such confidence? Well, as a young Sikh man who had never lived in Punjab and had never been in the embrace of Sikh culture, so to speak, that is exactly how I felt. I carried this burden of guilt. The pain was minor, because I had not quite understood what had happened in Delhi at that time. Why? Because it was all riots. What everybody understood was Mrs. Gandhi was killed by her Sikh bodyguards in retaliation for the attack on the Golden Temple several months earlier. And in a quote, understandable fit of spontaneous rage, the hurt residents of Delhi, having lost their beloved prime minister, spontaneously attacked the Sikhs. That was the narrative, squarely. And that's what I bought into, that's what I believed in. Also, I'm somewhat ashamed to say that because the people who suffered the most came from a very different class, if you want to call it that, I was not very touched by the events at that time. Yes, some of my relatives in Delhi had horror stories to tell, but they were nothing like what people in Trilokpuri and Mongolpuri had experienced. So that was my, 24-year-old self when I left India and came to the US. And quite by chance, as I was grappling with very personal issues of identity, I chanced upon a very different narrative of 1984. Now, part of that narrative came from hearing a pretty loud disturbance. So part of that narrative came from archival newspaper articles that I happened upon in my library. Most of them were in Western media, and the slant of the reporting was very different from what I had read in Indian newspapers. So that got me curious. But I was a skeptical young man, and I figured, maybe these Western newspapers are biased against India and Indians, and that's why they're writing things that paint India in a negative light. And then I chanced upon a couple of other things. One of them was a slim report titled "Who Are the Guilty?" produced by the PUCL and PUDR, two Indian human rights organizations. Of course, now that report is very well known. It's known as the so-called Black Book because it had a black cover. I had no access to it in India, but I read it in the US. And I was, flabbergasted because the narrative seemed very, very credible. It had not been written by Sikhs, it had been written by non-Sikhs. I did a little bit of digging into these organizations. They seemed to be legitimate. And my mind was in a whirl because the narrative suggested that what had happened in Delhi was very different from what I had read about and heard about. Then I found a second narrative. This was a reprint of an article by Madhu Kishwar that had appeared in Manushi titled "Gangster Rule." So Madhu Kishwar, in sharp contrast to many of her media colleagues, had reported fearlessly on the events of 1984 in Delhi, and I was shocked to find that her narrative completely meshed with the narrative that I read in the report, "Who Are the Guilty?" So now I had two unimpeachable sources that gave me an insight into what had really happened. And, the report on Delhi and Madhu Kishwar's articles were both very detailed, very specific. They talked about how the massacre had been organized. They talked about how people suffered. So naturally, this created a tremendous amount of turmoil in my heart. And then, sort of, my epiphany, in a certain sense, came from a couple of pieces of information. One of them was from my aunt who lived in the US and who had briefly moved back to India to the city of Patiala. And she told me that one of her family friends had witnessed a massacre of Sikhs at the Dukh Nivaran Sahib Gurdwara in Patiala. Now, this to me was astounding because I completely had bought into the narrative that while the attack on Golden Temple was regrettable, it was absolutely justified to flush out quote unquote Sikh terrorists. And this was the first time that I learned that other gurdwaras had been attacked as well. Now, of course, we know that the name of the military operation under which that happened was Operation Woodrose. So, learning about the attack and the massacre at the Dukh Nivaran Sahib Gurdwara was a huge event for me. And then the final thing was an academic paper by Dr. Veena Das, who used to be in Delhi at that time. She subsequently moved to the US and was teaching at Johns Hopkins. I think she still is there. This was a paper in which Dr. Das articulated the trauma of a group of young children who had survived the massacre and who had been settled in Tilak Vihar with a tremendous amount of sensitivity. Having observed these children at play, Dr. Das documented how they dealt with their PTSD. And one of the narratives that completely shattered me at that time was the story of a young boy called Avtar, who was deaf and mute, who had seen his father lynched before his eyes by a mob. And then this young child, unable to articulate his pain in any other way, whenever he thought of his father and his father's terrible end, he would use his hands and his body to enact what had happened to his father. There was another narrative about a young girl whose father was doused in kerosene and set alight. And this little child refused to let go her father's hand while he was burning. And the mob, which didn't want to hurt a child, tried to pull her away, but it almost seemed that she acquired superhuman strength and they could not separate her hand from her father while there was still a breath left in his body. Another shattering story. This was really the stimulus. And as all of this churned in my mind, what poured out of me was Kultar's Mime, which is the last piece in the book, a story in verse. It's impossible for me to talk about the writing of Kultar's Mime because honestly, I don't even know how it happened. It was just a very visceral response that was informed by my emotions upon learning of what had actually happened more than anything else. So that was the first piece that was written. And then the second piece that was written was the title story, Night of the Restless Spirits. It was very much influenced by 100 Years of Solitude. And then, of course, it was influenced by the attack on the Golden Temple. I had found another report on the attack of the Golden Temple published called Oppression in Punjab, which similarly provided a very alternative view to what the government had presented in its white paper and so on. So that was the stimulus for these first two pieces. And then subsequently, over the years, as I read more about 1984, I started understanding that the narrative of 1984 was much more nuanced than, quote, terrible things happened to Sikhs. Well, of course, terrible things happened to Sikhs. So that is sort of the subtext or the underlying theme of my book. But what I also was very touched by were the experiences of non-Sikhs, especially those non-Sikhs who had placed themselves and their families in harm's way to save Sikh lives. So as I grew older, as I started engaging particularly with younger people in the diaspora, I felt a sense of responsibility to tell this story with a tremendous amount of subtlety, examining it from multiple angles, and not fall into the trap of it being a cry of pain and nothing else. Because at the end of the day, I am not a cynic. I really believe that the common humanity that unites us all is tremendously powerful. And I think that that is the second theme of my collection, that while we talk about terrible, dismal things that happened and that we don't want to repeat, we also recognize that our common humanity is alive and well. So that's the sense in which sort of I am in this collection. I was fortunate to escape the brunt of what had happened directly, but certainly my emotions did not escape the impact after the fact through my engagement with all of the different writings and the narratives that I talked about.
Actually, yes. I mean, is this in itself is, a summary of the narrative around 84. What I pick up from here, as you spoke, and since I want to lay greater focus on the literary aspects of this talk today. So, as you talked about Kultar's mime, I'm also reminded of Chenua Achebe. After the Boer War, he was not able to write any novels, and he switched over to writing poetry. Very few people read his poetry, but he wrote wonderful poetry after that. And he said that I couldn't, actually deal with the genre novel post-war. And I think the very interesting style of Kultar's mime, the small passages or the small prosaic pieces, and in fact, it's more poetic in that sense. Just talk about these incidences, which have never let us come out of 84, has never let us come out of 84. And definitely also the question of vocabulary, the question of what is the right word to address 84, because it's not the riot, And a lot of theorists also talk about it. We are debating it. We are also talking about, whether it's a genocide or not. And it's not about what do we believe in. It's about a larger discourse around how do we look at, these incidences. And something which I'm again reminded of is, the field work when we did for the book in 2014. There was one of these survivors, a widow who was, she had worked all her life as a water carrier in a school, and this job was given to her as a compensation, because everybody in her family, all male members, had been killed. And she, as we were interviewing her, and she goes ahead and she says that they call it dange, they call it dange. Dange are not these. Dange are when two parties collide with each other, and it just happens by the way, right? So she says, when you plan it, when you spot everybody, when you mark people's houses, who lives where, and you put a cross outside those houses, and then when you particularly mark the Sikh houses, and you repeatedly keep coming again, you loot their houses, and then you mutilate their women, it's orchestrated. And she says, dange is not the right word for it. And I, for a minute, felt that, look at this experience, it's like this woman is perhaps not even very educated, but she knows the vocabulary, right? And that's what, made me think beyond academics, that made me think, about experience. And it was this experience that woman was speaking from. And so I think we have to be very careful about the vocabulary that we use, when we are addressing the violence, and particularly 84. And this becomes an embedded site of memory. You're never able to come out of these experiences as you're talking of. And coming back to your story, particularly the first story, Paji, I was also moved by the story, and I suddenly, when I read it, I was also reminded of Bapsi Sidhwa's Ice Candy Man, and particularly the ending of it, when Sham, the driver, comes, and he brings the mob and tells them that yes, there is a Sikh family inside. But something very interesting is the remorse, which Sham has. And that took me to Premchand, because there is a turning point, and Premchand always talked about that turning point. So Premchand said that human beings have an ability to kind of regret for what they do. So it may not be, Sham did not intend to damage or to hurt the family this way. But when he saw what had happened to Paji, and Paji was familiar to him, he was acquainted to him. He knew his house, and he's been carrying, the unnamed narrator again and again to that house. And there is a certain remorse. I think that remorse is very important, and that remorse is something par excellence in the story, because Sham comes to ask for forgiveness. And that's also a very, very important human element, and we often miss on that. This ability for people to realize that they've, erred, they've committed an error, and then also to be able to brave enough to come and say sorry and accept your mistake. And the mother's benevolent heart, the mother somewhere had forgiven him, you know. So towards the end, I had tears in my eyes, and it was not mostly for what had happened to Paji. There was remorse for Paji, there was grief for Paji, but the tears were for this interaction between, the mother and Sham actually. And I feel that's what touches me the most. So what I wanted to ask you was like, um, were there any influences of the kind like of Bapsi Sidhwa or somebody else when you framed this ending? How do you look at this ending, and how did this come up? So this process of
So
writing is what I want you to talk about. Yeah.
sure. So I'm a huge fan of Bapsi Sidhwa's, by the way, and Cracking India or Ice Candy Man, it was published under two different titles, remains one of my favorite books. And at the risk of sounding a little self-indulgent, I would say that I was absolutely thrilled when I got an endorsement from her, and I'm very honored by the fact that her name appears on the back of my book. The story, however, was not directly influenced by her. You have to remember that I'm not certainly not a theorist, and maybe not even, I'm struggling for the right word. Most of my career has been in technology and engineering and management. So when someone like you, who is steeped in literature, asks me about my process, I really don't have an answer because I really don't have much of a process. I sit down and I write. I write about what moves me. You have very correctly picked upon remorse as an important aspect of this story. I will tell you what informs my own thoughts about remorse. So, you know, you may or may not, I think, well, you are aware of the fact that Kultar's Mind, before it was published in this anthology, had life as a play. It was turned into a play by my daughter, Meher Kaur, and we toured it extensively, bringing it to India a couple of times. And I can tell you that when we were launching it, I got so many people coming to me and saying, why do you want to talk about 1984? These are old things, 30 years have passed. Forgive and forget, move on. Sikhs are known to have such large hearts. Why can't you let this go? And that made me ponder. It made me think. So, as a practicing, quote, unquote, practicing Sikh, and as somebody who is in very large part inspired by the ideals of the Sikh gurus, I understand remorse. I understand forgiveness. The one story that I go back to again and again is the story of the sixth Sikh guru, Guru Hargobind, and his beloved disciple Pende Khan, who the guru nurtured like his son since he was a young man, to the point that all the Sikhs around them got jealous of the special treatment that Pende Khan got. Pende Khan grew up to be one of the most formidable warriors in Guru Hargobind's army. was a mighty hero, and then towards the end of his life rebelled against the Guru and switched sides and went over to the Mughals and was killed by the Guru in hand-to-hand combat. So the writer of the Gurbilas Padshahi Chemi, which is, the heroic life of Guru Hargobind, very poignantly describes Pendey Khan's end. So as the Guru wounds him mortally, Pendey Khan is about to die. And then, the Guru says, Pendey Khan, it's time for you to recite the Kalma. And Pendey Khan says, oh, Guru, your sword is my Kalma. And at that point, the Guru takes his head in his lap and cries, and his tears fall on Pendey Khan's face, and he is redeemed. So this, to me, is one of the most beautiful stories of remorse, redemption, and forgiveness. So to me, as a practicing Sikh, remorse and forgiveness are fundamentally important. Maybe that's the reason why that crept into the story, into Shyam's character. I will also say this, though, it's important for me to say it. The reason why Pendey Khan was forgiven, the reason why Shyam was forgiven by the character Mammiji was that they felt remorse. They stood up and said, I made a mistake. I beg forgiveness. I would posit that perhaps the only way to deal, for the Sikhs to deal with the trauma of 1984 is going to be through forgiveness. Ultimately, that is really the only way forward. But we have a small practical problem. In order to forgive somebody, there has to be somebody to forgive. Until this day, after 37 years, there is nobody to forgive because the perpetrators still say, oh, we did nothing, that was a riot. So the point that I'm trying to make is forgiveness is fundamentally important to, really catharsis and the ability for the Sikh community to move forward. But it's not going to happen until somebody is willing to step up and say, you know what? I was culpable, or we were culpable. That's a significantly missing piece right now, which I think poses a huge problem for everyone. I'm
Yes,
sorry for
I mean
getting on my
that.
soapbox. That's an important thing from my perspective.
Yeah. So I think something where we are also heading towards is the question of apology. So until anybody apologizes, how do you forgive? So that apology has to be there, and the kind of apology that has come to us is very symbolic. So it's not like kind of a real apology. So what is missing is the apology. At the same time, I mean, it's also in the same story, Paji, Paji himself, the mother of that girl, is actually an admirer of Indira Gandhi, and he still believes, in her acts, and he has some faith in the government. He's not somebody who's anti-state, and it's then that he bears the brunt of it, and he is killed, and in fact he's killed, but I mean the police suggest that he has committed a suicide. As I read that part of the story, I was again reminded of another interview which was done by Uma Chakrabarti, where she talks about one of the survivors who said that, again, as you mentioned about the class, and class is apparently visible in these stories. So all those who would be wanting to write research papers, I mean, these stories are not just about identity, they're also about class conflict, right? So, so when Uma Chakrabarti talks about this woman, now in Tilak Vihar Widows Colony, so this woman talks about how, they were of a so-called lower class, and they had they were just hand to mouth, and the schemes launched by Congress government, the micro loans, had enabled them to, do a little better, and now they were on a threshold. And it is then that the violence happened, and they were reduced to dire poverty. So one thing is that those people who are just at this threshold bear the brunt of it maximum. And the second is that this woman talks about that how this family was dedicated to the Congress government. And she talks about, she says, when the mob came to our family, to our house, my husband was actually mourning for Indira Gandhi's assassination, and he had kept a fast. He had not eaten and not even taken water since morning, but he was lynched. He was killed by the mob. So this is also something very sensitive. So is it all about identity? And as you earlier mentioned, Manto, when Manto wanted to return to Pakistan, his best friend, the veteran actor Ashok Kumar, told him not to go. And that time Manto was drinking, and he said, "Look, I am a Muslim, right? I am not safe in this country." And then Ashok Kumar said that, "What kind of a Muslim are you? You are consuming liquor." So he said, "I am enough a Muslim to be killed." You know. So he says, "Utna Musalman to main hu jisme mujhe maar sakte hain." So he says, "I'm enough of a Muslim to be killed." So whether I believe in this religion, in this faith, whether I follow it or not is immaterial, because my identity stays with me. And that's where, at the end of it, all of us come down to, like, are we all social products, or is there a kind of an individual bearing? And I think these are pertinent questions which literature also enhances. Literature times and again keeps bringing them, and Manto in his work brings them. Thanda Ghost, who is the one who rapes that woman? And partition literature is something where the identity conflict actually crashes, because you do it to me and I do it to you, right? So there's no neat identity conflict there. So it's just rebelling each other, right? Moving from here, to maybe um, uh, something like, I was also really fascinated by the evidential passages in your stories, particularly in Curfew, and also in this other story.
The court martial,
I'll just get the
perhaps?
name. Yeah, court martial, right? Yes, absolutely, court martial. So in these two stories, to the audience, to the readers, I would say, if you want to know about the Sikh concerns and where the religion is and what it teaches, go to these two stories, right? Look at them for once, at least the court martial, and also how you see the legal matters have been brought forth. You quote the Constitution of India. You also quote the Army Code of Law. You bring a passage from Sikh history. So these are. I mean, my larger question is that this has not gone without research, right? So to many creative writers, they think that you can just sit and write a story, but stories do have an element of research in them. And so what I want to ask is, how much homework went into it? What were your perhaps sources where you went back to it? And how much time did you take writing this book? Yeah.
Great questions. I think the answers vary for the different stories, because some of the stories are a visceral cry of pain and nothing else. Others are very much informed by what I had read. You very correctly picked up on the court martial as one of the stories that probably required the most homework. And for the audience, I'll just mention this. It's a little known fact that in the wake of Operation Blue Star, the attack on the Sri Harbandar Sahib, or Golden Temple, in Ramgarh, which was, I think, then in Bihar, I think it might be in Jharkhand now, there was a regiment of Sikh soldiers that mutinied, who killed their superior officer, commandeered several trucks, and started driving towards Amritsar with no clear plan in terms of what they were going to do, but they mutinied. Now, the Indian Army is an institution which has managed to keep its nose clean through the decades of India's existence as a nation, despite the rot that we have seen in politics over and over again. So the Indian Army is widely respected. It's known to be a disciplined organization. So the notion of a mutiny in the Indian Army is shocking. And it's no accident that the mutiny did not receive a lot of press. It hasn't been talked about a lot. You have to dig really, really deep to even find references to the mutiny, and there is very little detail available. So I did have to do a fair amount of research for this particular story. And at one point, I struck gold. I actually managed to find the proceedings of some of the court-martials. So the soldiers had been court-martialed, and some of the proceedings were actually documented. So I freely borrowed from the actual documentation of the courts martial, and that sort of informs the story and provides a fair amount of color. Beyond that, most of my sources, particularly when it came to the events in Delhi, I've already talked about. The most significant ones were Who Are the Guilty, the PUCL-PUDR report, and the writing of Madhu Kishwar, Dr. Das's work. And then, of course, I was very inspired by my interactions with some of the people, including Dr. Uma Chakravarti, who I met in Delhi when I took Kultar's Mime, the play there. In fact, she was instrumental in the play sort of coming to India. I have to tell you a small, funny story, if you'll indulge me. I know that a lot of Indians, particularly when we were thinking about doing the play about 7 years ago, don't like to talk about 1984 for a variety of different reasons. Non-Sikhs immediately feel that Sikhs are very strident about this, that they're looking for revenge, they're blaming, and so on and so forth. Others have their own reasons for not talking about 1984. So a mutual friend introduced me to Dr. Chakravarti. I hadn't met her by then. I called her on the phone and I said, introduced myself. I said, we've created this play in the US. It's been well received. We would like to bring it to India. And, because I was aware of the sensitivity around talking about 1984 in India and not knowing Dr. Chakravarti very well, I kind of couched my comments a little saying, I'm not a political person. My play is not political. I'm not trying to get anyone excited. I just want the story to be told. And, in her own unique style, she snapped at me almost on the phone and said, "It's political. Bring it to India. It's political." And I completely approve. And when I met her in person and saw her inspire the young women who were in our cast, these were all American women, by the way, who knew very little about India, but their interactions with Dr. Chakravarti were absolutely wonderful to see. So yes, it was the experience of documenting and telling these stories is never easy. It's never obvious. And in my case, I would say that a lot of it happened through these sources that I talked about, and then these interactions with people sort of significantly informed the stories. I'll also tell you a little secret that I haven't talked about. One of the people who came to see Kultar's Mime was Mr. Harshmander, who I absolutely admire. And, when I went to Tilak Vihar, subsequently, my daughter and I actually managed to find Avtar, the young man who had inspired Kultar's Mime. I learned that the only organization that continues to do stellar work in Tilak Vihar to this day is an organization that was started by none other than Mr. Harshmander. And by the way, I also learned that Dr. Harshmander, when he was a young IAS officer, I don't have a lot of detail. This is just the little sliver of information that I had that turned into the curfew, that Harshmander himself was a young IAS officer who, contravening his superior's orders, called in the army and perhaps prevented a massacre. So that was kind of the little grain of real life knowledge that turned into the story, The Curfew. The character, of course, is not based on Mr. Harshmander. The character is completely fictitious, but the germ of inspiration came from the knowledge that he had been in the IAS, and he had been a young IAS officer in the times of 1984.
In fact, it's very interesting to, sometimes I feel that even the process needs to come out, and because like you are saying that people did not want to talk about 84. And as I was collecting my work, I had a lot of people talking to me, but nobody wanted to publish my book.
Of course.
So people would say, oh, 84, yes, I was in Delhi and this is what happened to me. And I talked with them for 2 hours on the phone. And then finally, I would keep waiting for a reply for them to accept my book. And it never happened, actually. And I waited for about maybe 4 years for a good publisher to take the book. And and I must have contacted about 30 publishers, in this thing. So I do relate to that. And yes, Uma, and I also happened to meet Nandita Haksar, So the PD UCR report that you were mentioning, she was a big hand in that. And I happened to ask both of them separately that, was there anything that scared you? And both women said, nahi, hum to nahi darte. And that was like, and Uma did tell me that, she had recorded and it was like quite surprising. It's 84, 85. She's doing all these recordings in the camp. And she said that we did think that somebody might come and I might be interrogated by the intelligence or something of the sort. And we had a number of tapes we did multiple tapes of these recordings and hid them at friends' houses. And so they did talk about, how they went about doing this. It's not that it was without scare. There was a scare, but then these women were resolute, and more importantly, they were women, So
and if you'll humor me, I want to quickly go to a very powerful part of Amitav Ghosh's article, where he talks about this march by the Nagrik Ekta Manch, following the events in Delhi, where they are confronted by a gang of toughs, who are probably going to attack them violently. And very spontaneously, all the women in the group move to the front and stare down these gundas, and they just dissipate. I mean, powerful. That immediately reminded me of Dr. Chakravarti when I read that piece. I revisited the piece, a few months ago, and I remember reading that and thinking about her.
And I think the name that needs to be mentioned here is Poonam Utreja. She was an active part of the Nagrik Ekta Manch at that time. Yes, so that's one. And maybe a quick last question is what I'm going to take up. And we're going to come to this question of women. And this, the story Curfew has this little girl of the Paiji, the beautiful girl of Paiji. And the girl is missing while the other 3 members of the family have been killed. And I think that's also very not just important, but it's crucial to bring out these incidences, because the question of women around the entire discourse of Chaurasi is still missing. Mm-hmm. And Pratiksha Bakshi actually talks about it, and she brings in certain figures, and then but the sad part is not a single FIR has been launched. Stories have not come out. Pratiksha talks about how, some of these women who had men in the family never spoke because they felt that the men were feeling pretty ashamed that they could not save their women. and those who did not have any men in the family did speak about their experiences, but not to the extent where something could be done at an institutional level or some kind of a justice be given to them. So, I mean, that's an observation. It's not a question, but this is where, I would say that it is really crucial to talk about what actually happened to women. And I am also reminded of Jarnail Singh's book I Accuse, because he does talk about Lokpuri, block number 32, where there were massive gang rapes throughout the night.
So you raise a really important point, which sort of addresses, well, first of all, sexual violence against women was very much sort of prevalent during these events, and it is absolutely important that it be addressed in whatever way possible. The pain is so significant, and you're exactly right in pointing to this collective shame that the Sikh community and the Sikhs of Delhi hold in their hearts. And we have to kind of step back and look at who the Sikhs are and how they have been perceived to really understand that. Particularly in the 18th century, when Mughal authority in the Punjab was breaking down, and when Ahmad Shah Abdali attacked northwestern India 9 times, we all know that the only force that stood up to Abdali in some manner were the bands of Sikhs at that time, who were loosely organized. And to this day, the exploits of these Sikh leaders are legendary, and what is celebrated to this day is the fact that they would often free captives, young girls that the Afghans had captured and were dragging off to Afghanistan, and restored them to their families. So, particularly in the 18th century, Sikhs acquired this sort of heroic image of the quote unquote protectors of the weak. Now, you could, debate this endlessly, but the fact of the matter is that this self-image became a fundamentally important part of the Sikh psyche, and Sikhs continue to take pride in this until this day. So now you have this very same community which had to stand by and weep in anguish as their daughters and their sisters were set upon, not being able to do anything about it. So the shame, the pain of 1984, the trauma of 1984 is definitely has a layer of shame wrapped around it for the Sikh community. And the fact that there has not been an acknowledgement, there has not been catharsis, there has not been healing, all that it does is it ensures that this collective, this commie trauma or communal trauma, if you want to call it that, just keeps getting buried deeper and deeper. I think that this is something that literature can really, really help address. Now, in Kultar's mind, one of the most graphic parts of the story is the assault on this young girl called Rano. Now, in a certain sense, this is fictitious. Unlike the other 2 characters, the little child whose hand gets burned and the title character, this character and what happened to her was not based in the story of any one individual. Yet, we know that there were hundreds of Ranos, and we have to tell their story. It's not going to bring them justice, but the story needs to be told. Because if it's not told, it's going to be forgotten, and then we just have to wait for the next instance, and there are going to be another 100 Ranos. That's why I think that literature can be very, very effective in addressing this. I mean, you could argue that in a country like India, the number of people who are going to read The Night of the Restless Spirits is minuscule, and who knows if it'll ever have any impact. But you know what? Maybe there will be 100 other writers who will be inspired to write about this. and maybe 100 other writers will tell 1,000 stories, and then at some point it will touch our consciousness in some manner. I mean, that's what really drives me. That's what motivates me. I watched 90 performances of Kultar's Mime because I toured with the company, and I can tell you that every performance was gut wrenching for me, even though the lines were the same, the acts were the same. And when What Happened to Rana was enacted on stage, it was really, really sort of, it crushed me every time, because that's what actually happened.
And moreover, the question of woman actually is a collective question for, like, as we began, you talked about human rights. It's a question of the woman community on the whole. And one of the stories I'd like to mention here, which I've also done earlier, and that's one of my favorite stories in the anthology which we did, Black November. This story is by Rachel Bari, and she talks about the responsibility it doesn't matter either. And she talks about a girl, who goes for tuitions, who's being wooed by a boy who follows her every day to the tuitions, but the girl is not kind of interested in him. And now, after the assassination, the entire environment around that alley where the girl is going is very tense. So the girl is a bit scared. As she is moving there, there's nobody, in the lane, and she turns and she sees that this boy is following her again. And she goes to that boy and she says, Bhaiya, mujhe bacha lo. You know. So she asks for help. And now towards the end of the story, this boy is, talking to his friends, bragging how he saved the girl. Actually, he did not save the girl. He had mutilated her. He had, raped her. And the last line of the story is, perhaps she was not even a Sikh. It doesn't matter either. And this is where, this question of woman is a common question. It's a collective question. So how do we just restrict it to communities or to, certain religions or to certain identities?
We
This
can.
I fail to understand. We can't
can.
do that.
And we shouldn't.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't. And, we are sort of almost running out of time.
Yes.
And I think we
Yes.
may want to take a couple of audience questions at least. But I do want to sort of go back to my roots as a Sikh and again emphasize that everything that Guru Nanak teaches us sort of flies in the face of tribalism, if you want to call it that, because Nanak's concerns were broad and universal. When he encountered the massacre of Sayyidpur after Babur had attacked the town, he spoke out powerfully, not about the pain of his followers, but about the pain of Muslim women and Sikh women. So I would say that, particularly as a Sikh who is talking about 1984, I feel a tremendous amount of responsibility not to narrowly focus on the 1984 that I'm writing about, but to focus on the numerous 1984s that preceded this one and followed it, like Godra, like 1,000 others, like what was about to happen in Delhi. It felt, just when the pandemic hit, when the Shaheen Bagh agitation was going on, it is incumbent on us to talk about each of these instances and really, at a very visceral level, feel the same pain about them, about those instances, because who's the perpetrator and who's the victim doesn't matter. At the end of the day, this is human suffering that is unnecessary. And it's only when we care about somebody else's pain can we even have a small hope of preempting the next 1984. That to me is fundamentally important. And I hope that it comes through in my writing as well, because it's something that is very, very deeply felt.
Yes. Thank you. I think it's very important. Yes, absolutely. I would, I think, ask Rakesh or Samudra to join in to take the questions from the audience, please?
Thank you so very much. I mean, it was an extremely enlightening. So we have a few questions from the audience. I hope you can see it. So I'll just read it out, I suppose. Good evening,
It's
sir.
it's actually on there. I think everybody can see it very clearly. So I would recommend that in the interest of time, we jump right into it. And I apologize if I sound like I'm rushing, but I do have another event in exactly 15 minutes. So I do want to try and get to as many of the questions as possible. In the short answer to this question about the role of the news media was that the news media was, because of a combination of control by the government and self-censorship, the news media was very dishonest about reporting on 1984. And the greatest testament to the fact is that 37 years later, what happened on that day is still called a riot, when we all know that it was definitely not a riot. So the news media abdicated its responsibility and behaved in a most shameful manner. There were exceptions. We have to remember that. Madhu Kishwar was an exception. I believe The Sun reported very, very fearlessly. There were a few brave journalists who reported fearlessly, but the vast majority of the media just essentially spouted the propaganda of the government at the time.
So moving on to the next question. Uh, I'll just ask them to load the next
Please.
question. Yes, just give me a moment. I had a few questions of my own, sir, which is
Please.
about the culture of disavowal that follows the tragedy, as you said, about the silence. As in, could you comment on why that is, in essence, of not acknowledging a tragedy, even though in hushed tones everybody knows what happened?
So let's
That
great question. Let's name names. And by the way, all this is documented in the report titled "Who Are the Guilty?" So if anybody wants further detail, I would suggest you seek it out. It's freely available on the web now. At least 3 sitting Congress ministers were seen during the massacre going around and encouraging the mobs. The most senior Congress leaders who are mentioned by name are HKL Bhagat, Jagdish Tytler, Lalit Makan, and then relatively minor leaders like Arjun Das and Dharamdas Shastri. They were seen encouraging the mobs, giving them a reward, a bottle of liquor, and 100 rupees. That was the amount of money that was given to people for looting, burning, raping, and murdering. These are documented facts. The report also documents that while these senior leaders were the ones who were actually seen there were multiple people who said that the orders have come from above. Upar se aaya hai. Now you tell me, who was above HKL Bhagat? What that tells me is that the highest levels of government were involved in quote unquote teaching the Sikhs a lesson. So in that sense, Samudra, your question almost becomes rhetorical when the same people who ordered the massacre or their successors continued to be in power for decades, who was going to talk about it? Now, some people might have felt that when the Congress was swept aside and the BJP, came into power, things were going to change. Well, some things did change. I will point to one comment by Mr. Rajnath Singh, who was the Home Minister at that time. Of course, I tend to be a cynic when politicians are involved. He was in Tilak Vihar trawling for Sikh votes, I imagine. And at that point, He was the first government figure who went on record to say that what happened in 1984 was not a riot. What happened in 1984 was genocide. This was the Home Minister of India who said this. But the fact of the matter is that one doesn't have a lot of hope from the BJP government either. Because the minute you start talking about 1984, right on its heels comes a conversation about Godhra. Who wants to have that conversation? So the answer is very simply this: those who stalk the corridors of power with impunity have no stake in either talking about this or bringing about justice. So it is no surprise that there has not been a reckoning.
Thank you so very much for that answer, sir. I had just one quick comment as well. Could you please recommend certain readings that people could perhaps follow uh, to, uh, to essentially learn about the tragedy in its?
Sure. So the first resource I will point to you to is the excellent anthology that was edited by Dr. Ishmeet Kaur Chaudhry. It's called Black November. It's widely available. And I'm telling you, I haven't read all of it, I have to confess, but the few pieces that I read touched me, moved me. It's tremendously important work. So please, I would urge you all to read it. Please go back and read Who Are the Guilty, the report on 1984.
Thank you.
Of course. It's a vital document. It's a vital part of Indian history. It's not just for Sikhs to read, it's for everyone to read. I will tell you this: when we presented Kultar's Mime in Mumbai, a 16-year-old girl, a non-Sikh girl, was in the audience. She went back and she wrote in her blog, "Today I saw this powerful play at the NCPA presented by a group of actors from the US. I was very angry when I saw this play because I never knew that something like this had happened to people in India. I don't want anything like this to ever happen to anyone again." This young girl completely understood why it's important to learn about the 1984 massacre. It's not so that the Sikhs can feel better. We have to read about it because your generation, you're the ones who are going to make sure that it never happens to anyone again.
Thank you.
I would also point you to the work of Ram Narayan Kumar, a book titled Reduced to Ashes. I would point you to a book by Mr. Manoj Mitta, a respected journalist, co-written with Harvinder Singh Phulka, who has been fighting for justice for the past 37 years. These are all wonderful, wonderful resources that everyone should engage with. And oh, by the way, between Dr. Chaudhry and I'm sure that we can send you a list of resources that you can perhaps, share with your group as well. We could do that offline. We literally have time for one more question. I apologize.
Yeah,
Okay,
just
this
one
is the last
thing, Gauri. Yeah, just one thing. Gauri Gill has actually brought in a list of a lot of works which is widely available on internet. So if you just Google Gauri Gill and 1984, you would find. She's documented what are the works on 84. So that's one elaborate list. And yes, we would pen down something and send it to the voyage. Yeah.
So very quickly addressing the question on the screen from Amanpreet Kaur, the short answer is, I don't know. I think we would have to look into who pulls the strings at the Virasat-e-Khalsa. I am not hesitant about naming names, if a Congress government rules in Punjab, probably it has very little interest in talking about 1984. But I think that what should happen is that, 84 is a vital part of our history. We need to talk about 84 not because we want revenge, quote unquote, or because we're angry. We want to talk about 1984 for exactly the same reason that we study any traumatic event in history. So to that extent, I think that all of you young people should petition Virasat-e-Khalsa and question them and ask them, this is such an important event. Why do you have no references to it? It's a great question. I do
Also,
have to.
sorry, just one more point. Actually, this is a very important question, and it does point out at the failure of the Sikh leadership. So it also talks. If we talk about the state, that state has not been giving justice to us. Did the Sikh leadership help us assist the victims to even fight for justice? So this shows. I mean, this kind of a negligence or even ignoring or erasure at the part of the Sikh leadership actually shows that it's their failure.
So I'm already starting to get calls from my next event, which is in 5 minutes. So I do have to
So,
apologize. Thank you so much for organizing this to everyone at Voyages into the Past. And Dr. Chaudhry, thank you so much for the wonderful manner in which you conducted this conversation. Um I'm really indebted to you for really bringing up so many important issues, and then at a very personal level. I have interacted with a lot of people since this book was published, but I feel that you have got the book in ways that many others haven't, and for that I am very, very grateful. Thank you so much.
I'm equally grateful, and I'm really happy that this young group of students have organized this talk. And I must say that it's a pleasure. You know, I
Thank
think
you.
I am extremely happy, and I'll be one of those who would always cherish this book. So thank you for doing this book. Actually, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
I must thank you all for joining in. It was a genuine pleasure to have you with us. And again, thank you for accepting our invitation. Uh,
Take care.
yes, yes, yes. So, yeah. And with that, I'll just ask our audience to follow us on Instagram and Facebook for live updates. And we also upload most of our talks onto our page on YouTube. So please subscribe to that. And with that, over and out.